You have probably heard of the Voynich Manuscript. It's a book made in 15th century Europe, and despite a century of our collective efforts, we still can't read a single word of it. What I have always found at least as intriguing is that this even applies to the words we should be able to read. On the last page of the manuscript, folio 116v, someone wrote these 4 lines in the Latin alphabet. Plain old medieval letters. The style can be dated to the first half of the 15th century, the same age as the parchment, which means there's a good chance that these words were written by someone directly involved in making the manuscript. If we could understand what this means, we might get a rare glimpse into their lives 600 years ago. But we can't, even in these 4 lines spelled out for us in our own letters. The manuscript refuses to give us a foothold. While researching this video, I presented this fragment to a range of specialized scholars, and they all agree it's a tough nut to crack. Keep in mind that few pieces of medieval parchment have been scrutinized as much as this one, so if there was a sensible, easy, clear-cut translation to be found, we would have had it already. I had originally intended this to be one video, but soon decided to split it in 2, since there's just so much ground to cover. In this first part, I will explain what we do know about this fragment, or at least the parts that seem the most secure. And then in part 2, I will bring in the help of some scholars, people who have not publicly spoken about the Voynich Manuscript before, but who are specialized in inscriptions like these. But first, let's see what we're dealing with here. In medieval manuscripts, it's often the case that the last page is left blank, and it's often the first place we look when we want to find various scribbles and annotations that aren't a part of the work proper. So it's not unusual at all to find something written in an open space like this. The parchment of this folio is in a very bad shape, which does not make our job any easier. We have various types of holes, old repairs, stains, fading. There are drawings, but we will have to leave those aside for another time. Alright, let's begin. You may have noticed that the top line is separated from the other 3. It seems to consist of 3 words, though spacing overall can be tricky in this kind of semi-connected handwriting. The first word is the one that's discussed most often, because it's the one we can actually work with. The writing is relatively clear, and there's not much uncertainty about the reading of the letters. Most researchers read this as Pox Leber, of which the Leber part is the easiest to understand. In Middle High German and still in Modern German, this means liver. The Pox part needs some more explaining. Leber is a common ingredient in German cookbooks, and it's often the second part of a compound, as seems to be the case here as well. The first part tells us which animal the liver is from. Pig's liver, cow's liver, hen's liver. If it has a liver, they'll cook with it. I'm using the genitive s, like cow's liver, on purpose here in English to mirror the grammatical structure we're interested in. Okay, so what kind of animal is a pox? Well, the dominant view is that it corresponds to the modern German Bock, the etymological equivalent of English buck. In German, it most often refers to male goats, but it can be almost any horned animal. Bock isn't pox, but we're getting there. First of all, fluctuation between B and P is extremely common in medieval German dialects. For example, in this 15th century Bavarian manuscript, one of the ingredients is pox pluot, buck's blood. I got this from CoReMA, by the way, a wonderful collection of medieval German cookbooks. Interestingly, when bucks are mentioned, it's usually the animal's liver they're interested in. These are some of the spelling variations I've encountered. You may notice that one letter is suspiciously absent though, and that's X. Pox and pox sound exactly the same, but to render the K ending and the genitive S as a single X, that's a very unusual spelling choice. It would be like if in English I would write buck's liver like this. There are a few examples of something like this happening in medieval German, but it's extremely rare. So in summary, buck's liver works here, but with one caveat that the spelling is uncommon. Pox Leber gives us something to work with, but the same cannot be said for these next 2 words, We simply don't know what they say, and I'm not aware of any reading that managed to gain some traction. They're just tricky to read, not in the least because of the deplorable state of the parchment. For example, shapes like these resemble the top of P, like in box. So did their descenders, that's the lower part, get erased? You would be surprised at the amount of different plausible readings for these words, and none of them make a lot of sense to us so far. Now we will momentarily skip the two middle lines and first look at the bottom. Interestingly, we get two Voynichese words, which obviously we can't read. They seem to be integrated in the text, but we can only speculate about the reason. All I can say is that these are normal, properly formed Voynichese words that would not be out of place in the text of the manuscript, so probably this writer knew what they were doing. Now, remember in the top line I mentioned the unclear descenders of P. Well, we have exactly the same phenomenon here. These words too are problematic, whichever way you read them. I'll put some options up on the screen, but know that none of them are particularly useful or convincing. After a series of 6 problematic words, it's time to find our footing again, and luckily Zonim is solid ground. Browse any medieval German cookbook or really anything that involves series of instructions, and you will come across Zonim. Then take. This usually follows after a conditional clause. If you want to make stuff, you first have to take stuff. Here's an example from a 14th century German manuscript. Willst du einen guten Fladen machen von Kalbsleber'n, so nimm Kalbsleber'n und hacke die klein, and so on. I didn't actually know that I was actually going to attempt to read this, but here we are. If you want to make a good pie from calf's liver, then take calf's liver and chop it finely. If you want to do this, usually if you want to make this, then start by taking this, then take. I picked this example out of literally thousands because it illustrates 3 things for us. First, it's got liver. Ingredients like our buck's liver and the phrase zonim both belong in the context of recipes, so it links our top line to the bottom line. It also shows how often we get words ending in en in German. Here's an article, an adjective, a noun, and a verb. And it just so happens that these 2 mystery words before zonim also end in en. Again, I do not know what they mean, but it seems to be an indication that they fit at least in the German language context. Finally, in most cases, including this one, zonim is immediately followed by an ingredient. The first ingredient you need to take, nimm, to start cooking, which leads us nicely to Gasmilch. Usually this is understood as a dialectical form of Geißmilch, German for goat's milk. Are you noticing a theme here? Bock, from the first line, most commonly refers to the male of a goat. And now we have the milk of a goat. Just like in the case of box with an X though, spelling is a bit unusual here. The monophthongization of Geiss to Gas could be defended on dialectical grounds, but dropping the L from Milch is quite bizarre. It's really unattested in medieval sources as far as I'm aware, so we must assume it's a scribal omission if we want to keep our milk. This reading of the last line as, in that case, take goat's milk, has been the standard interpretation since Professor Richard Salomon proposed it in the 1950s, and it still holds up. Especially zonim is important since it indicates beyond any shadow of a doubt that the writer is using a German dialect. And together with what looks like ingredients, it strongly points to text genres that involve series of instructions. Finally, there's some kind of a large O or a circle. Richard Salomon thought it was short for oder, the German word for or, and he hypothesized that the sentence was cut off. I personally doubt this explanation since the circle is much larger than any O in the text and it's connected to a row of dots. For all we know, it's a schematic representation of the next step, which is to drizzle your goat's milk onto an egg. Now, why did I decide to skip ahead from the first line to the last? Well, I see linguistic and thematic connections between these two, but the middle lines are different. Even without trying to read a single word, there's something you should notice right away. There are these crosses separating each word or word pair. They might seem strange or whimsical, but to any medievalist who has studied marginal annotations before, this should be a familiar sight. Words mixed with crosses like these indicate that we're likely dealing with a charm. Charms are a little known but fascinating part of medieval life, and I'll be talking about them in the next video, including an interview with a scholar who wrote a book about charms. But that's for next week. We'll first focus on what's written here. Now for this next part, I'm going to give an unscripted overview of these two middle lines. It's just a bit easier if I can just point right away at what I'm talking about so you can follow along on my screen. The first word here is one of the most infamous words in the whole Voynich manuscript, I think, because it's really emblematic of the way we can barely understand this inscription here. There's basically two ways people read this, either as anchiton or michiton. I prefer anchiton, and I'll tell you why. First, look at the letter A. It's open at the bottom with a curve here, a diagonal line, and then a straight vertical line. You can see this in several words, but also notice the variation in the three A's in this word, for example. So there's some variation, but the shape of the letter is quite consistent. And so this first part of anchiton or michiton would fit in with that. And in that case, the next letter would have to be N. People who prefer to read this as michiton, so starting with MI, assume that this stroke here is the letter I, which is possible. And this would be a capital M. It can't be a regular M because in the examples we have here of regular M or regular N for that matter, they don't start with a curve, they start with a straight leading serif. And also, if it were a capital M, I would expect it to be a bit larger, but it's really just the same size as the regular letters. You could say, okay, what about the dots on the I here? When we have a clear letter I, it is dotted, although the shape of the dot is variable. Like here, it seems to be a kind of faded line, but that's all okay in medieval manuscripts. That's expected. But is this actually a dot or just a smudge? To make that out, we can look at the multispectral images, which Lisa Fagan-Davies shared a while ago. They were taken several years ago, but only now they've become available to the public. Basically what they did was make a scan of the page under various kinds of lighting, infrared, ultraviolet, and that might bring out faded ink. Here you see smudges in a different color, but we don't get this bright pink that we'd expect if there was a dot. Based on the multispectrals, I'd say inconclusive at best, but probably it's not dotted. So all that is why I personally prefer to read this as AN. Next, this is a pretty normal CH ligature. Take a note of the descender on H. The descender, that's the line that goes under the baseline of the text. As far as I'm aware, scripts in this style always have a descender on H. We'll need that later. This is clearly an I based on the dots. We've also seen that in the multispectral images. The next part can be read as ton or con. The distinction between T and C is really not always clear in medieval handwriting, and you sometimes need the context to figure out which one is meant. Here there's a little ascender, so ton is probably the preferred reading, but if someone wants to read it as con, that's really fine. The spaces aren't always very clear. There are big ones and smaller ones. To some extent, that's a consequence of this style of writing that connects some letters but leaves little gaps as well. When you have a scribe that leaves relatively large gaps, it can be difficult to see where real spaces are, at least again without the context, so you can't predict which word you're supposed to read. In the next word, the letter shapes are pretty clear, apart from the last one. Here, that's an awkward H shape that isn't properly formed like a D or a short S. So maybe this word is oladabad or oladabas, but neither mean anything. So if you want to split it up, then you could kind of mold it into some semi-Latin like olla with double L dabas. You were giving a pot. The next word is also tricky because it starts with a merciless row of 5 minims. Minims are vertical strokes, the basic building blocks of letters such as I, M, N, U. Usually it's possible to guess from context, but this is the Voynich manuscript and we don't have much context. Also, this thing here, you'd want to read it like an O, but it's got legs. We've never really found anything like it. Is it a mistake or some kind of weird diacritic? It's a mess. And then to top it all off, we've got another badly formed H shape. I'd say here probably it's meant for short S, but it's weird and ugly. Taking all that into account, you might want to read this as multos, Latin for many, which I think is an okay option. No problem here, this is T and E, so te, which, assuming Latin, is the accusative form of the second person singular pronoun, meaning you or yourself. Then moving right away over here, it's another mess. We start off with our T or C, and then the last letter looks like R. In early 15th century handwriting, you'll often see R written like a V shape. But this thing in the middle might be a messed up A, but it's all mushed together, and the A is not formed at all like the other A's in the text. So it might be something else. It may just be that they wanted to start writing this next word, but made a mistake and scrapped it for all I know. Next word is cere, C-E-R-E, no problems, which is good for a change. Cere sounds Latin-like. It would be the ablative form of the word cera, which means wax. So something like with wax or in wax. That's something you can work with, right? Some people like to read these two chunks as an attempt at one word. So you could make something like carcere out of it, which is again the ablative form of the Latin word for prison. Something like in prison or in confinement. It feels like a stretch to me though, given the large space and the messed up first part. Next word clearly reads P-O-R-T-A. And then one of those ugly H shapes again, so maybe portas, which would be gates in Latin. And then finally, this one actually makes the most sense of all. In charms, when you have a capital N, and this is actually a capital letter because it's so much bigger than the supposed M in michiton, that stands for the Latin nomen, and you have to substitute it with the name of the person you're reading or writing the charm for. So say, for example, I want to heal your broken leg, and then I say my charm, and I fill in your name here instead of this N. It's used quite a lot also for priests who have to dedicate a prayer to someone, for example. The template will have an N there, and they can just fill in the name of the person they're reading it for. Usually it's separated by dots rather than crosses, so that's a bit exceptional, but all in all, not a problem at all. To recap for this first line, we have anchiton oladavas, maybe oladabad, maybe multos te, then a mess, cere portas, and the name of the person who it is applied to. It doesn't mean anything that we know of, but more about that in the next video. Let's move on now to the second line, which I think is a continuation of the same phrase because of the pattern of the crosses that continues. And you can also kind of see it in the layout of the lines and the margins. This first letter is confusing to some people, but I'm certain it's a long S and not an F. Here you can see an F. I'll show that for you in the multispectral scan, actually. You can see this big fat crossbar here, right? Now down here you do get a thorn where they double the line, as is the custom. That is what makes F and S notoriously hard to tell apart even in printed texts. But this is 6. Next word is marix, M-A-R-I-X, no problem there. This is probably morix, but maybe this could be you. In that case, it would be movix or movix. This is vix, V-I-X. But look how weird this I is compared to, for example, this I. Did they correct a mistake here, or is the handwriting just so variable? I don't know. It's remarkable. But here they seem to have it dotted with a line, so vix it is. This next word I have always read as ahia with an H, but someone pointed out to me that it's really unlikely to be H because one, you don't have the descender, remember before that I pointed it out in the other word, and two, you see an indication that it was closed off this way with the pen kind of scraping this leg, and then it continued here, so it looks like they intend to close it like a B. So it's probably Abia, though it's unclear and awful. Next we have a familiar figure, Maria, the mother of Jesus. That's good. We don't have to think too much about that. There's even an extra cross, which I think just marks that this is an important name, although we don't often see that in charms, that they put an extra cross on top of a word. Still, I just think it's an invocation of a holy name, which is quite expected in the case of Mary as the intercessor between humans and heaven. All in all, this line is pretty clear. We have six Marix Morix Vix Abia Maria. You can hear the internal rhyme and like rhythm, but we'll get back to that in the second video. In summary, for the whole inscription, we start out with a German-sounding line, which seems to contain an ingredient, probably, most likely the liver of a male goat. Then two words we cannot read, but also have an overall German flavor, I would say. Just to be clear, when I say German, I'm referring to the continuum of medieval dialects, not to any political or geographical boundary. In the bottom line is the same deal with Sonim, which is very clearly German, and Gasmich, which I think is still best interpreted like Richard Salomon did all those years ago, as a weird spelling or dialectical take on Geismilch, goat milk. Then I would say that whatever's going on in these two words seems to belong to the same linguistic sphere. The en endings are very common in German, but we just haven't really figured out how to deal with these words yet. Then for the two middle lines, we're really looking at something else. It's much more Latin-like. The common en ending is gone in favor of os, as, or even x, which is not very German at all. And the overall appearance of these lines really points to charms, as Voynich researchers have been thinking for a long time already. Now let's take a step back and look at the whole folio again. Some 15th century person, most likely one of the makers of the manuscript, apparently had a reason to write this on the last page of the manuscript. That's why so many people find this so fascinating. You're looking here at a rare opportunity to learn something about these people. But the language and the genre are inconsistent and the phrasing incomplete. We can't understand most words, and even when we have a decent suspicion of what we're supposed to read, the spelling is off. This video may have left you with more questions than answers, but I believe when it comes to the Voynich manuscript, questions are usually a better starting point than false confidence. Now, I do think there are avenues left to explore, which should at least allow us to tighten our grip on what this thing might be, and one of those has to do with genre. We are almost sure that the crosses indicate a charm, but what are charms? In which context are they usually found? What kinds of words and phrases do we expect around them? What might be the reason for writing a charm in a book? That's what we'll explore in the next video. I hope to see you there.